Hey guys, what's going on? Just here to talk a little bit about and go over a little bit of some of the great hits and go down the list of every single Royal Rumble winner in the history of the Royal Rumble. Starting with 1988. 1988 was the inaugural Royal Rumble. A little bit of background: the match was conceived by Pat Patterson, who, of course, was the legendary from the golden age of the 1980s. And basically, it was an idea that came about him from the San Francisco territory where he had worked at for many years when he was the partner to partner with crippler Ray Stevens under the promoter Roy Shires, and it was basically a new spin on the old concept in professional wrestling of the battle royal, but it was a reverse battle royal. So instead of the traditional battle royal where everybody starts out in the ring together, the concept would be one guy enters at a certain interval of time, and this basically became the premier gimmick match of the WWE in the same way that Jim Crockett Promotions, the main rival to the WWE in the 1980s, had War Games. WWE had the Royal Rumble. And the first Royal Rumble aired on the USA Network in 1988, and it was an answer to another event that had happened earlier in the year, the Clash of Champions, which itself was an answer to WrestleMania 4. Basically, a little bit of background. I went over it in the Jim Crockett the Jim Crockett tribute video, where I talked a little bit about the rivalry between Vince McMahon and Jim Crockett during the territory era. But basically, what it was in 1988. um, well, it starts way back in '87. In 1987, Jim Crockett Promotions wanted to air their pay-per-view, also featuring a battle royal called the Bunkhouse Stampede, which they were running in Long Island, New York. Dusty Rhodes ended up winning. Hawk ended up being one of the finalists. It was a complete failure, and Jim Crockett Promotions never really went there again. But they wanted to air this on Thanksgiving uh, Day, the same time that Vince McMahon wanted to air the first Survivor Series. But Vince McMahon basically says, no, you can't have my pay per view air like an hour or so later and have Jim Crockett. If you're going to carry my pay per view, you can't carry Jim Crockett's pay per view. But not only did he say you can't carry that specific pay per view, he also said that you will not be able to carry the coming year's WrestleMania, which was WrestleMania 4. Now, this is coming on the heels of the biggest wrestling pay per view, the biggest wrestling extravaganza of all time, WrestleMania 3, of course, featuring Andre the Giant and Hulk Hogan, 93,000 plus Pontiac Silverdome. They took wrestling to another level. The Rock and Wrestling Connection era had peaked in 1987. Wrestling was completely mainstream, so the cable companies want to carry WrestleMania 4. They don't really care about the Survivor Series because it's a new event, and who really cares about that? Now, I think Vince McMahon was a little pissed off that Jim Crockett had run in his territory, ran in the New York territory, because Jim Crockett had been on TBS since 1985. Vince McMahon actually sold him the company. Vince McMahon had purchased the rights to Georgia Championship Wrestling, which was the first wrestling promotion since the 19. It had been on it had been on national syndication, the TBS Superstation, since the 1970s, and Vince McMahon purchased it in 1984. An event called Black Saturday. The Southern fans didn't like it, and They shit all over it because it was pre-taped matches and it wasn't the wrestlers that they were used to. So Vince McMahon had to sell it back to a Southern wrestling promoter because Ted Turner was going to kick him off the station anyway because Turner wasn't getting the ratings that he thought he would get. And plus, he didn't want him doing double duty business with USA Network. Keep in mind, cable was just starting out at this time, and a lot of people didn't have a lot of people in the rural areas where people really liked professional wrestling, especially in the South, they didn't have cable. So cable companies were competing for wrestling content because just like in the 1950s, when television was first starting, wrestling was always was a staple because it was self-produced. It was produced by whatever promotion um, was producing. So you didn't have to hire writers. You didn't have to hire actors. The wrestlers themselves were the actors and performers, and it was cheap to make. And it was something that cable companies, which were just starting out, really wanted. So both USA Network and TBS were competing for it. TBS had it first with Georgia Championship Wrestling, but Ray Gunkel died, and then his wife sold his his share, and then Jack Briscoe of the Briscoe brothers sold Georgia Championship Wrestling to Vince McMahon. So he buys it in 1984. He goes on it. The Southern wrestling fans that are used to their traditional wrestling, their NWA wrestlers that they have been seeing since 1975, they reject it. And they say, we don't want it. So what then happens? Vince McMahon has to sell it to Jim Crockett. And with that money, he loses to launch the first WrestleMania. But after the first WrestleMania, it's on the stratosphere. And in 1987, they're the biggest thing ever. So the cable companies want to have WrestleMania 4. So in order to carry WrestleMania 4, keep in mind they have to also carry the Survivor Series. But if they carry the Survivor Series, they can't carry Starrcade 87, right? So they end up carrying the Survivor Series, most cable companies. Some cable companies, according to Dave Meltzer in San Jose, California, do carry both. But the Survivor Series 87 is a bomb for more than one reason. One, because they had the World Heavyweight title on hands of Stone Ronnie Garvin, who wasn't really a main eventer in Jim Crockett. And two, because most cable companies just didn't carry it. So move over to 1988. Jim Crockett finally says, "Okay, Vince is gonna try to play me and try to get the cable companies to not carry my stuff. So I'm gonna air a free cable special on TBS the night of WrestleMania 4." And that was the first Clash of Champions when Sting finally became a main eventer and wrestled a 30-minute match with Ric Flair to a draw, and that's where the Ric Flair and Sting rivalry really began. So WCW or Jim Crockett Promotions or the NWA ends up competing with the WWF that night and doing better numbers than WrestleMania 4 because it's on free cable. So Vince, of course, not to be outdone, he launches the Royal Rumble with Pat Patterson's concept on USA Network that same year. And the first Royal Rumble winner is Hacksaw Jim Duggan. Hacksaw Jim Duggan had just jumped from Mid-South Wrestling, where he was a huge main eventer, first starting off as a heel in the Rat Pack with Ted DiBiase and Matt Bourne, who would later become Doink. And then later becoming a babyface and being one of the huge stars of the Mid-South Wrestling. But Mid-South in the late 80s was about to go under because of the oil crisis situation, and also because a lot of its stars like Butch Reed and The Junkyard Dog left the company to come to the WWF. So, Hacksaw Jim Duggan comes to the WWF. Big fanfare. When he first shows up, he faces off against Andre the Giant, who, of course, the top heel in the company. And he also wins the Royal Rumble. What messed him up was later that year he was caught in the car in a kayfabe breaking moment with the Iron Sheik, and that kind of derailed him. And he would later be rehired with the company. He would actually stay with the company until 1993 when he left to go to WCW for the big guaranteed contracts that they were later doing. And in the Wrestling War of 1988, it was Vince McMahon that ended up winning because Jim Crockett had to sell his company to Ted Turner. And WrestleMania 5, the following year, in 1989, was the largest pay-per-view up to the Attitude Era. So that was the first Royal Rumble. It really didn't mean anything because at that time they didn't have in the stipulation that the winner goes on to face the champion. 1989, Big John Studd wins it, and it's whatever. Big John Studd is coming back to the company. He was a big part of WrestleMania 1, $10,000 slam challenge against Andre the Giant. If WrestleMania 1 didn't have a main event, I would say that was it. It was a huge angle. At the time, even Andre the Giant wore a mask alongside the masked superstar Bill Eadie. I don't really remember when Andre was a face, but he and Big John Studd were at odds. Now Big John Studd comes back in 89. Not only does he win the Royal Rumble, but he also would be a referee in Andre's match at WrestleMania 5 against Jake the Snake Roberts. Royal Rumble 1990 was won by Hulk Hogan. It was supposed to be won apparently by Curt Hennig. That year, Curt Hennig was on his big undefeated streak. But Hogan being Hogan derailed Curt Hennig, and he never got that big push to the top, unfortunately. He had just come in 2 years earlier from the AWA after being AWA champion, but Hogan is Hogan, so he wins in 1990, and he wins in 1991. Again, 1991 is famous because him and Ultimate Warrior face off in the match, and they have that moment where everybody else is eliminated, and it's them two facing off, and it was. Excuse me. That was that was in 1990. 1990, when they faced off, and it was the prelude to what they would have at WrestleMania 6, their match. 1991, Hulk Hogan also wins. Of course, that was the Royal Rumble where Ultimate Warrior lost the WWF Championship to Sergeant Slaughter, and it would set up the match between him and the Macho Man Randy Savage, which is a classic match at WrestleMania 7. Now, 1992 was very interesting because 1992 was the first time that something was at stake. It wasn't a shot at the champion at WrestleMania. It was the WWF Championship itself. Now, The Undertaker debuts at Survivor Series 1990 as Ted DiBiase's mystery partner. Then, in Survivor Series 1991, he defeats Hulk Hogan with help from Ric Flair for the WWF Championship. Then at a pay-per-view they have in Tuesday in Texas, Hogan beats him back, but Hogan actually cheats and blinds his eyes. So Jack Tunney, the on-screen president of the WWF at the time, sees this and then strips Hulk Hogan of the championship. So now there is no champion. The title is vacant, and this is considered to be the most star-studded Royal Rumble that there is in history that exists, because this has the Texas Tornado, this has the British Bulldog, this has Shawn Michaels, who just turned heel, this has Ric Flair, this has Sid, this has Hulk Hogan, has a bunch of everybody from the golden era of the World Wrestling Federation that we all grew up loving is in this Royal Rumble. And it comes down to the final four of Hulk Hogan. Well, excuse me, the final three of Hulk Hogan, Sid, and Ric Flair. And Sid and Hulk Hogan have been partners since SummerSlam 1991, when Sid was the referee for Hogan and Warrior's handicap match against Adnan Mustafa, who was the Iron Sheik, and Sergeant Slaughter, the match made in hell, right? Madison Square Garden, 1991, SummerSlam. Ultimate Warrior walks out, and then Sid and Hogan pose, and that's when Sid turns babyface. He had just made the jump from WCW to the WWF, and fans were loving Sid. Sid was unlike anything we had ever seen in the Wrestling Federation up to that point. And this was kind of interesting because you had Ric Flair, who was a WCW star, former WCW champion, the face of the NWA when it was on fire, when they were really going at it with with the WWF in the late 1980s. And then you had Sid, who was another star of the early WCW and a former horseman during that time period. He even broke Brian Pillman's neck at one of the Wrestle Wars in the early 90s. So it comes down to these two. And Sid eliminates Hulk Hogan. The fans are loving it. Really, they're booing Hulk Hogan. They don't want to see Hogan win the WWF Championship, but it's up for grabs at this Royal Rumble. They're really like, nah, hell no. We don't want to see that. And Hogan pulls Sid out, and he eliminates Sid, and Ric Flair wins the match. And Ric Flair gives one of the greatest promos that I've ever seen in my life. And it's a famous promo, end of Royal Rumble 1992. With a tear in my eye, this is the greatest moment in my life, or paraphrasing. And Ric Flair, Bobby Heenan is there. Bobby Heenan the whole night was pushing for Ric Flair, pushing for Ric Flair. Remember that it was Bobby Heenan that introduced the big gold belt on Primetime Wrestling, which before Raw was WWF's primetime show, big show. And he came out and he said that Ric Flair was the real world's champion, that the WWF champion, which was Hulk Hogan at the time, was illegitimate, that he wasn't the real world champion. Now, that's something crazy for the WWF to say, because, again, they've been going at it with Jim Crockett Promotion / NWA, and they never really acknowledged another promotion on TV. But eventually, WCW ended up suing them. Ted Turner ended up suing them, and they had to use the tag team belt, blurted out, when Ric Flair would go around claiming he was the real world champion. And they just said, fuck it. And Ric Flair wins the WWF Championship here at Royal Rumble 1992. Now, Royal Rumble 1993, we went over this, featured Yokozuna winning the WWF Championship. And this was the first year, winning the Royal Rumble. This was the first year that the Royal Rumble ever featured the winner of the match going on to face the champion at WrestleMania. And he wins the match by throwing Randy Savage on top rope. Randy Savage goes for the cover. Who knows why Randy Savage went for the cover? He'd been in other Royal Rumble matches. He should have known better. Kayfabe logic, he should have known better. But he didn't, and Yokozuna won. And, of course, Yokozuna went on to beat Bret Hart to face the champion until WrestleMania 9 when Hulk Hogan comes back and beats him in a couple of seconds. Oh, well. But Yoko was really dominant at this point. Yoko had the white tights. Now, Royal Rumble 1994, that's an interesting one. Now, because you didn't have one winner, you had two. Lex Luger and Bret the Hitman Hart. Part of the reason was Lex Luger was really hyped up in the summer of 1993. He had a bus taking him all around the USA, kissing babies and stuff. The Lex Express, like, people were really behind him, but he beat Yokozuna on a count out. And he didn't win. He won the match, but he didn't win. He didn't win the championship. Ask Seth Rollins what that's all about. But anyway, Vince McMahon still wanted him to go on to WrestleMania 10, the anniversary of WrestleMania in Madison Square Garden, and win the WWF Championship against Yokozuna that year, 1994. There was a clause in the contract that if he lost at SummerSlam, he could never get another shot. But of course, just like anything else in wrestling, they went back on it. And he was going to get another shot. He was supposed to win the WWF Championship. But what happened was the fans were not getting behind him. They were instead getting behind Bret Hart. Bret Hart had started to do the angle with his brother Owen since Survivor Series 1993. And the fans were behind him 100%. They wanted to see him get revenge on Yokozuna and win the WWF Championship back. So rather than have a triple threat match, was not done at that time. I think they hadn't even done it on ECW yet. I think Tommy Dreamer and Sabu and Terry Funk, which was the first one, happened in 1995. If you watch the original ECW, you can correct me on that. But they hadn't never done a triple threat, so they didn't do that here. You ended up having Bret Hart wrestling twice. He wrestled Owen Hart earlier in the match, and then he would wrestle Yokozuna later. And they had a coin toss, and if Lex Luger had lost that coin toss, he'd have went on to wrestle Crush. And then Yokozuna, but he wrestled Yokozuna first. And then Bret Hart wrestled Yokozuna. Actually, Lex Luger almost won, too, at WrestleMania 10. He laid out Yokozuna in the middle of the ring. But because he punched Mr. Fuji and Jim Cornette, Mr. Perfect, who was a special guest referee, disqualified him. And it was a callback because him and Mr. Perfect had a match last year. And it was another callback with who was the special guest referee in Bret Hart's match, because it was Roddy Piper, the same guy he had beat 2 years ago to win the Intercontinental Championship for the second time. It was pretty cool. It could have been Mr. Perfect as a callback for Bret Hart, too, because that's who he beat the first time at SummerSlam 91. But it wasn't. But the point is, here in the Royal Rumble, they had two winners, Lex Luger and Bret Hart. Kind of bittersweet night for Bret Hart, kayfabe-wise, because he and his brother lost in their attempt to capture the tag team titles from the Quebecers. And Owen Hart famously kicked Bret's leg out of his leg. I kicked your leg out of your leg, Bret. A famous moment from Royal Rumble 1994. Royal Rumble 1995. Now, this one had a lot of fanfare going into it because of the inclusion of Pamela Anderson. Pamela Anderson at the time, Baywatch 1995 was a huge show. All the guys loved it because of the jiggle. It was sort of like the jiggle that Fred Silverman had brought to ABC in the 1970s. It was just kind of like that. The jiggle, the sex appeal on Baywatch was good. Nobody could really remember any of the plots from Baywatch, even the one in later years in Baywatch when WCW stars such as Vader and Ric Flair appeared. Nobody can remember that, but people will remember Pamela Anderson, sort of like the Kim Kardashian of her day. She was a beauty queen, and she was here at the Royal Rumble, and it was said that she was going to escort the winner to his championship match at WrestleMania, because WrestleMania 11 was going to feature a lot of celebrities. It was going to feature Nick Totoro, Jonathan Taylor Thomas of Home Improvement fame. Was going to feature LT Lawrence Taylor, of course, in the main event against Bam Bam Bigelow, which the angle was set up here at Royal Rumble 1995. Bam Bam Bigelow and his partner Tatanka lost in a tournament match against Bob Polly and 1-2-3 Kid. The titles were held up for grabs after Shawn Michaels and Diesel's tag team had broken up, and they were the champions. They were no longer going to be a tag team, so they couldn't be tag team champions anymore. So the titles were held up for grabs, and in the finals, Bigelow lost. And when Bigelow is all upset because he lost basically the two jobbers, the 1-2-3 Kid and Bob Sparkplug Holly, and he sees Lawrence Taylor laughing, he pushes Lawrence Taylor, and that sets up their match. At WrestleMania 11, it was a lot of celebrities. But this whole Royal Rumble in Tampa, Florida was built around who was Pamela Anderson going to escort in the championship match at WrestleMania 11, a big, huge event that was held in the Northeast, Vince McMahon's territory. In fact, Hartford, Connecticut, the home of the WWE, where the Titan Towers were and still are. So it was going to be a huge event. Unfortunately, it was an event that flopped. Hardly any of the matches were good. LT was pretty good at WrestleMania 11, but that's a whole nother topic for another video. But who wins this Royal Rumble is Shawn Michaels. Now, Shawn Michaels came in at number one, the first guy ever to come in at number one and win. He gets eliminated, and British Bulldog, who was the second guy, the second to last guy, comes in and actually eliminates him. But Shawn hangs on by 1 foot, so only 1 foot touched the ground, not two. So when British Bulldog thinks he won, Shawn Michaels pulls back up and then eliminates Bulldog, and he wins the Royal Rumble. Now, he was unexpected. I wasn't really expecting Shawn Michaels to win the Royal Rumble, but maybe I really was, because Diesel was the champion now. And him and Diesel, like I said, since Survivor Series 1994, or going back all the way further back since SummerSlam 1994, when he cost Diesel the Intercontinental Championship against Razor Ramon. He accidentally super kicked Diesel, and that allowed Razor Ramon to get the win. And then he did the same thing at Survivor Series 1994. So finally, Diesel had enough. That's when Diesel turned face. And then not so long after, Diesel defeats Bob Backlund in Madison Square Garden in mere seconds to win his first and only WWF Championship. So I did expect Shawn Michaels to win. But he was still a mid-carder at that point. So this was his real elevation. And the match between Shawn Michaels and Diesel at WrestleMania 11 that he went on to have was pretty okay, decent, probably the best match on the show as far as wrestling-wise. But the night after, he turned babyface. So, I guess, Sid, who came back as his bodyguard, Sid would appear in his corner at WrestleMania 11. Sid turned on him and joined the $1 Million Corporation with Ted DiBiase as his manager. broke Shawn Michaels' back. Michaels would then end up not coming back until the Survivor Series, where he took on one of the members of the Million Dollar Corporation, Kama. Now, Shawn Michaels is on a roll until an incident happens to him in late 1995 in real life. The incident that happened to him in real life was he was supposedly beaten up by 7 thugs, or a number of thugs, I forgot how many, in Syracuse, New York. Really, it was one guy, and it was an ex-Marine. And Shawn Michaels, being Shawn Michaels, was mouthing off to him, and he gets beat up. So they decided to incorporate this into storyline. The night after Survivor Series in 1995, Shawn Michaels is having a match with Owen Hart. Owen Hart does an enziguri to the back of Shawn Michaels' head, and it looked like Shawn Michaels he collapsed in complete exhaustion. It looked like he almost died, and it felt real at the time because this was still a heavily kayfabe era, and Vince McMahon didn't say nothing, complete silence. So it wasn't like Vince, was overselling it or anything. It felt real, even though it wasn't. It was an excuse to get Shawn Michaels off TV. And going into the Royal Rumble 1996, then, they played a bunch of sappy video vignettes of Shawn Michaels. He was a more huge over babyface going into the Royal Rumble 1996. So I never expected him to win the Royal Rumble 1996. And he wins the Royal Rumble 1996 by eliminating Diesel at the end. Kind of still harping on this Diesel Shawn Michaels thing, but now a reverse. Diesel had kind of he didn't turn on Shawn Michaels, but he did attack Bret Hart after their match in Survivor Series 1995. Kind of turned him heel because it was unsportsmanlike conduct in the minds of the fans. Later on in the year, during a tag team match of the Undertaker and Bret Hart, against him and Shawn Michaels, he would turn on Shawn Michaels by hitting him in the back with a chair, setting up their good friends, better enemies match in April of 96, which will be Kevin Nash's last match in the WWF until 2002. So, that's that. Shawn Michaels is your Royal Rumble 1996 winner. Now, 1997, all that went down. Diesel and Razor Ramon left the WWF. Shawn Michaels went on to win the World Wrestling Federation Championship that year in 1996, win the 30-minute Iron Man match against Bret Hart. He had a rather lackluster run as WWF champion. Had a couple of good matches. May of 96 against Mankind. A couple of failed matches against Vader, like at SummerSlam 96, and a couple of failed matches. 2 pay-per-views in a row with the British Bulldog. Winning one in which the lights went out. In Your House, Beware of Dog. They did an angle where he hit on Diana Hart. That went nowhere. And then finally lost the WWF Championship to Sid at MSG. So heading into the Royal Rumble 1997, where at the hometown of Shawn Michaels, San Antonio, California, San Antonio, Texas, excuse me, California, San Antonio, Texas. He is going for his second World Wrestling Federation Championship. He has a cold or whatever, but he does win the match. He defeats Sid. It was supposed to be Vader, but Vader was penciled in at the last minute because Shawn Michaels didn't want to work with Vader. He didn't really get along with Vader, and that derailed Vader's push, and that was unfortunate, but that's just the way it happened. WWF is losing a lot of steam at this point because, again, Razor Ramon and Diesel, aka Scott Hall, had gone to WCW and they had formed the NWO, and everybody was paying attention to what Hulk Hogan was doing in WCW, what Scott Hall was doing in WCW, and what Kevin Nash was doing in WCW. Even though the pay-per-view that they had to run against the Royal Rumble in 1997 was not as good, Sold Out was one of the worst pay-per-views they ever had, but it was the NWO's first and only pay-per-view. It was from Cedar Rapids, and I was a fan of both companies at this time, and I liked both, but I was only allowed to order one on pay-per-view, and I did order Sold Out. I was an NWO mark. I was everything NWO. I was into it, even though the Giant versus Hulk Hogan never really appealed to me. I still ordered NWO Sold Out, regrettably, because the only good match was Eddie Guerrero versus Six in the ladder match. But I should have ordered this one. Royal Rumble 97 was spectacular. Now, what's interesting about this, Mankind and Terry Funk are arguing on, they get eliminated. One eliminates the other, and they're both arguing back and forth. And Stone Cold Steve Austin, who had won the King of the Ring in 1996, and he had been a phenomenon. And at the Survivor Series 1996, when the same event Shawn Michaels lost the championship to Sid, Bret Hart made his return after months and months of being gone from the company. And he had a spectacular match with the up-and-coming Steve Austin. Oftentimes, people will make it seem like Steve Austin won the King of the Ring 1996. It was supposed to be Hunter Hearst Helmsley. Well, Triple H got punished because they did the curtain call when Diesel and Razor Ramon were about to leave. And Vince McMahon had to punish somebody. He couldn't punish Shawn Michaels because he was the champion. He couldn't punish the other two guys because they were about to leave. So he punished Triple H. Rather than have him win the King of the Ring, he ran with Stone Cold Steve Austin. And WWE documentaries make it seem like automatically Stone Cold Steve Austin was over with the fans. Automatically, after the King of the Ring, after he beats Jake the Snake Roberts at King of the Ring, he automatically, is a sensation with the fans just because he said Austin 316 says, "I just whooped your ass." A play on Jake Roberts' Christian gimmick that he'd been doing since he came back last year at the Royal Rumble. Vader and Steve Austin made their debuts at the 96 Royal Rumble. But that wasn't the case. He wasn't over immediately. He was still wrestling Mark Merrow and people like that up until he wrestled Bret Hart. It was the match with Bret Hart that really got him over the edge. And at this Royal Rumble, people wanted to still see him face Bret the Hitman Hart in a rematch. So when Bret Hart comes out, Austin had eliminated everybody. And Austin looks down at his hand like this. He couldn't wait for Bret Hart to come out. But when he gets eliminated, the ref doesn't see it because he's distracted by Terry Funk and Mankind over there fighting. So he then comes, like the rattlesnake he is, still a heel at this point, comes back in. He gets down to the final four. Finally, he's the guy on paper that wins the Royal Rumble. But because it was disputed, the Undertaker and Vader, Bret Hart, the Undertaker, and Vader go for a first time ever fatal four-way match. The following In Your House pay-per-view. And Bret Hart ends up winning that. And the title's put up for grabs because Shawn Michaels lost his smile. He had this big win against Sid in his hometown. Then he comes out on Thursday, Raw Thursday, says he had a back injury, he lost his smile, he gives up the title. The title is now vacant. and they put it up for grabs in the final four. This is the last time we really see Vader in the main events. In Mania, he was having a feud with The Undertaker. He gets pushed down after this. But Bret Hart wins that match, but the official winner of the Royal Rumble in 1997 was Stone Cold Steve Austin. But it was a good wrestle. I mean, it was a good Royal Rumble. It featured a lot of luchadors and stuff because WWF was doing this thing where they were trying to bring over luchadors because they saw the success that Eric Bischoff had with them in 1997. So that was pretty cool. 1998 now. We get to 1998. Bret Hart is no longer with the company. He got screwed at Survivor Series 97 when Shawn Michaels wins the WWF Championship for the third time. He and Shawn Michaels had backstage heat. They didn't wrestle at King of the Ring 97 like they were supposed to. Shawn Michaels threatened to jump ship to WCW. Vince McMahon would have none of it, so he agreed to have Shawn Michaels come back and turn heel. He turned heel on The Undertaker by hitting The Undertaker accidentally with the chair at SummerSlam 97, allowing Bret Hart to win his 5th WWF Championship. And then finally, him and Undertaker have a #1 contenders match at Hell in a Cell. That's when Kane first debuts, right? It's October of 1997, the same day that Brian Pillman dies. And Shawn Michaels becomes the #1 contender, and he defeats Bret Hart in an incident where he puts Bret Hart in his own finishing maneuver. Ring the fucking bell. I don't have to tell anybody about the Montreal screw job. Pretty much all wrestling fans already know it. But in the lead-in to this Royal Rumble, it was announced that the WWF would be doing business with Iron Mike Tyson, who himself was coming off a huge controversy in the boxing world in which he had a world heavyweight title fight where he bit off Evander Holyfield's ear. So he was suspended by the Nevada State Athletic Commission. He was not allowed to box, and he was basically broke. And the WWF offered him a ton of money because they needed the publicity at the time. The WCW had Dennis Rodman. They even had Dennis Rodman wrestle at Bash at the Beach 1997, where he teamed with Hulk Hogan to take on Lex Luger and the Giant. It was a huge media event, so WWF needed something. Again, Vince McMahon was not to be outdone, just like at the first Royal Rumble. He needed something to put him over the edge, something to get his company back on top, popular with the fans, in the same way that Mr. T had done at the first WrestleMania. LT didn't really work. LT kind of fell flat. That didn't really get him the publicity that he had expected. But again, he's bringing back celebrities, and this is Iron Mike Tyson. So throughout the whole show, Mike Tyson is showing up at the VIP box, even cheering Stone Cold Steve Austin. Now, the next night on Raw, Vince McMahon would announce him, and Tyson and Austin would have their famous confrontation where Jim Ross would say the famous words, "Austin wants Tyson, Tyson wants Austin." Austin would say, if you can't understand what I'm saying, I always got a little bit of sign language, so here's to you. You got your eyes locked on the eyes of the world's toughest son of a bitch. And then Vince McMahon is all like, you ruined it, Austin. It's a classic moment. It was so classic that even though at that time there was no kayfabe or anything, people pretty much knew that wrestling was fake. It was still on TV, right? It was still on the news. It was on every evening news station. It was huge. Mike Tyson and Stone Cold Steve Austin. He said, what I was saying to you right now, Tyson, is I want a piece of Mike Tyson's ass. Go back and look at that promo that year. Anyway, Stone Cold Steve Austin ends up winning, and he's going to WrestleMania to face Shawn Michaels and D-Generation X. It was so classic that Mike Tyson even joined DX. You know, like they had another incident when Tyson was set to appear where Shawn Michaels does the same thing Austin did, and he calls out Tyson. Tyson has the WWF Attitude shirt on. Shawn Michaels rips the shirt off, and Tyson reveals the DX shirt underneath. And it was like Tyson was having the time of his life being in the WWF. Growing up in New York, he had been a fan of the WWF in the territory days. He knew all the guys. He knew George the Animal Steel, Bruno Sammartino, Gorilla Monsoon, all the classic WWF guys, WWF guys from the 1970s. So he was, and even the 80s, even 80s and even 90s, he even recalled a promo that Mick Foley had done in his first Mankind vignettes about George the Rat that Mick Foley himself didn't even recall. They were supposed to bring him in right before he lost to Buster Douglas, and there was talks of him doing a boxer versus wrestler thing with Hulk Hogan instead of the Ultimate Warrior. But that never materialized because he lost, and then after that he went to jail. So when he finally came back in 1995, Peter McNeely fight, I think Vince was talking to him, but then he had his troubles and Vince came to his rescue. But anyway, Tyson was having the time of his life, being a part of DX, being a part of this huge cornerstone WrestleMania. Needless to say, we all know what happened. Stone Cold Steve Austin wins. And unfortunately for Shawn Michaels, he was having a casket match with The Undertaker where The Undertaker flipped him back and did a backflip, and it took Shawn Michaels out of professional wrestling until 2002 when he came back at SummerSlam. So he missed most of the Attitude Era, even though it can be argued that he himself started the Attitude Era. He, Mike Tyson, and Stone Cold Steve Austin. But anyway, Stone Cold Steve Austin is the winner at this Royal Rumble. Now, after WrestleMania, everything goes as expected. Mike Tyson counts Shawn Michaels out. The referee is out of commission when Stone Cold Steve Austin does the stunner. And Mike Tyson, the special guest enforcer, comes in, counts Shawn Michaels out, and he and Shawn Michaels have a confrontation. Shawn Michaels berates Tyson, and he says, "You're supposed to be with me, Mike. You're supposed to be with me," because he's a DX member, right? So Tyson, not to be disrespected, knocks out Shawn Michaels. Boom. Shawn Michaels is now out of wrestling. Jim Ross says his famous words, "The Austin era has now begun." Tyson lifts up the Austin 316 shirt, takes off the DX shirt, and then has his classic post-WrestleMania press conference where he calls Stone Cold Steve Austin Cold Stone. We all mess up once in a while. I've even messed up in this video. But it is a success. And after this, kayfabe-wise, Vince McMahon wants Stone Cold Steve Austin to become the corporate champion that he always envisioned. We all knew behind the scenes Vince McMahon wants his champions to be a certain way, especially his babyface champions. And this is the official birth of the Mr. McMahon character. People say that it was the Survivor Series 1997 when he pulled back the curtain and revealed for the first time on screen that he was the owner of the WWF. But it was really here where he becomes the main heel of the storyline of him against Stone Cold Steve Austin. And for the whole year of 1998, him and Stone Cold Steve Austin have their rivalry. He gets different champions to fight against Austin. He gets Mick Foley in various iterations, even Stone Cold's ex-tag team partner, Dude Love, and then finally Mankind, right? And he's doing everything in his power. He, Jack Briscoe, and Pat Patterson, the Stooges, to eliminate and try to get the title off of Stone Cold Steve Austin. In fact, when he and Stone Cold Steve Austin have their match on Raw, it is the first time in 83 weeks that Raw beats Nitro in the ratings. So it is this storyline of Austin versus McMahon that allows the WWF to turn the corner in the Monday Night Wars, and eventually would allow them to defeat WCW and buy WCW in 2001, but that's a whole nother issue. But this rivalry of McMahon as the evil boss and Austin as the everyman really pushes Stone Cold Steve Austin over the edge, gives the WWF and Stone Cold Steve Austin the hump they need. But now, for the first time ever, Vince McMahon is the main character in one of his own storylines. So he decides at the Royal Rumble 1999 that he is going to enter the Royal Rumble. And indeed, it is him that wins the 1999 Royal Rumble. The winner of the 1999 Royal Rumble is Vince McMahon himself. Of course, he doesn't go on to face the champion, who is The Rock, because in the lead up to this, he had formed his own faction, the Corporation, and he does in fact get his corporate champion by screwing Mankind out of the finals of the WWF title tournament. See, at Breakaway in September, both The Undertaker and Kane had pinned Stone Cold Steve Austin. So the champion was unclear, but all the McMahon character cared about is that it was off Austin. So he just takes the belt, and then the belt is declared vacant. There's a tournament that night for it, and everybody thinks that McMahon is going to side with Foley because he's been siding with Foley ever since the night after WrestleMania 14, right? Foley has been his guy, and everybody thinks, oh, The Rock turning babyface, he's leaving the Nation Domination now. He is one of the hugest stars. He's on his upswing, and people either want him or Austin to win the WWF title tournament. But in the end, it ends up being him. He ends up putting a sharpshooter on Mankind, and then in a callback to the Montreal Screwjob, McMahon calls for the bell, and instead of hugging Mankind, he hugs The Rock, and The Rock is his corporate champion, and they form the Corporation, this faction to go against Stone Cold. And this leads into the Mankind Rock rivalry, which they have a tremendous I Quit match. Mankind took so many chair shots in this I Quit match. It was unbelievable. And The Rock wins the WWF Championship in this I Quit match by videotaping an interview segment where Mankind had said he was going to make The Rock say I quit, and making it seem as if he Mankind said I quit. And it was really hot stuff. It was really good stuff. The WWF was on fire in 1999. So eventually the match at WrestleMania 15 becomes The Rock versus Stone Cold Steve Austin. The Rock is the corporate champion against Stone Cold Steve Austin, the challenger. But the winner of this is Vince McMahon. Crazy, right? Vince McMahon winning his own Royal Rumble. Now, The Rock, after the night after WrestleMania 15, he fails to defeat Stone Cold Steve Austin, so the Corporation is bad at him. They kick him out. He becomes the number one babyface in the company, especially after Survivor Series 1999, Stone Cold Steve Austin is taken out. He is run over by Rikishi. They come with that stupid storyline where Rikishi did it because he did it for The Rock because he wanted to see the first Samoan guy become the WWF champion. It was some racial storyline. It was really stupid. But then eventually they just scrapped it and said that he did it because Triple H paid him to do it. So, they moved away from that storyline. But point is, The Rock, over the course of 1999, early 2000, had become the biggest star ever, and people wanted to see him and Triple H go at it because Triple H and him had a history ever since The Rock won his first Intercontinental Championship at that same Raw Thursday where Shawn Michaels lost his smile. Rock, as Rocky Maivia, had won his first Intercontinental Championship. And then later on, after WrestleMania 14, when both guys took control of their respective factions, The Rock taking control of the Nation of Domination, kicking Farouk out, and Triple H taking control of DX after Shawn Michaels was injured and left the company. He brings in X-Pac. He lets the New Age Outlaws join. DX, they formed the DX Army. DX and the Nation of Domination. The summer of 1998 have their big rivalry. DX parodies the Nation of Domination with Triple H as The Rock and X-Pac as Mark Henry, famously X-Pac in blackface. You're not going to find that on Peacock Network anymore. And they have their ladder match at SummerSlam 1998. And their ladder match is tremendous, one of the best ladder matches. I famously remember watching SummerSlam 1998. I wasn't there. It was at Madison Square Garden, but I was at summer camp the previous month, so I couldn't really get the tickets. But I wanted to go because it was Undertaker versus Stone Cold Steve Austin in the main event, both baby faces and stuff. But the match people really remember is Triple H and The Rock. Anyway, long story short, people wanted to see Triple H versus The Rock at WrestleMania 2000, aka WrestleMania 16. We didn't get that. The Rock does win the Royal Rumble. The Rock is your 2000 Royal Rumble winner. But it was some controversy with who went over him in the Big Show. So the Big Show was included in the first Fatal 4-Way match at WrestleMania. It was pretty lame. It did come down to the process of elimination. And it did come down to Triple H versus The Rock. Should have just been Triple H versus The Rock. At first, this Royal Rumble, Triple H and Cactus Jack have their Hell in a Cell match. And it was supposed to be Cactus Jack / Mick Foley's last wrestling match, but he comes back like a month or so later at WrestleMania for some reason. McMahon in each corner, Vince McMahon in The Rock's corner, Stephanie in Triple H's corner, Shane in the Big Show's corner, and Linda McMahon in Mick Foley's corner. The first time he wrestled as himself, Mick Foley, at WrestleMania, it was really unclear why. But again, at least the WrestleMania match ended with The Rock bottoming Stephanie McMahon. But The Rock is your 2000 Royal Rumble winner. Now, what about Stone Cold Steve Austin? I said that Stone Cold Steve Austin was out with an injury for most of 1999. He does come back, and him and Triple H have a tremendous match at No Way Out. That year, but his comeback was so hyped because again, he's one of the biggest stars, and when you're away, your comeback is really hyped, as Triple H himself would see the following year. So Stone Cold Steve Austin's comeback was really, really hyped, and he goes on to win the 2001 Royal Rumble. Now, 2001 would be a year of mixed bags for Stone Cold Steve Austin. He would go on to face The Rock in a babyface match now at WrestleMania 17. But it will be a mixed bag for the WWF because they would purchase their competition, WCW, like a month later. And also because at the end of WrestleMania 17, they decided to turn Stone Cold Steve Austin into a heel, having him align with Vince McMahon. What sense did this make? Nobody knew. And then later he would align with Triple H in the two-man power trip, even though they were feuding. I guess, they both hated The Rock, so that was the justification. And then, later on in 2002, they would bring in WCW wrestlers like Booker T and DDP, and ECW wrestlers like Rob Van Dam and Raven. But rewinding the clock back to Triple H. Triple H and Stone Cold Steve Austin form this tag team. They win the WWF Tag Team Championships, and they are facing Chris Benoit and Chris Jericho. And in this, Triple H gets injured. So the whole invasion angle, WCW coming in and ECW coming in, forming the alliance with Shane McMahon owning WCW and Stephanie McMahon owning ECW, which of course makes no sense. But Triple H misses all of that. Triple H is out for all of that. And it's not to the early part of 2002 that Triple H finally comes back to the company. I remember like it was yesterday. It was MSG, Triple H, the first returnee in 2002. Like I said, Kevin Nash, Scott Hall, Hulk Hogan would all come back, but that would be at No Way Out. Later, Eddie Guerrero would come back. Later, Shawn Michaels would come back, but that would be, of course, that would be later. Triple H was the first returnee in 2002, and it was a huge deal. And of course, it was pretty obvious that he was going to win the Royal Rumble and go on to face the Undisputed Champion. Now, who was the Undisputed Champion? The very guy who had put him out of commission, or one of the guys, Chris Jericho. Chris Jericho went on to have a tremendous year in 2001. He was one of the biggest players in the Alliance versus the WWF storyline, right alongside The Rock. Some of his quips against Stephanie McMahon, classic stuff, let the boobies hit the floor and everything. Some of The Rock's lines against Booker T going into the feud of SummerSlam 2001 with The Rock for the WCW Championship against Booker T. Thomas Jefferson, motherfucker. Were pretty classic stuff. The Rock and Chris Jericho really shined in this. So they gave Chris Jericho his shot. He wins the WCW Championship and the WWF Championship and unifies them as the Undisputed Champion, but he still hasn't scored to settle with Triple H. And he does that at WrestleMania 18. Of course, their match gets overshadowed by The Rock versus Hulk Hogan. Hulk Hogan coming back to the company for the first time in 9 years. But Royal Rumble 2002, Triple H is your winner, and he goes on to defeat Chris Jericho for the Undisputed Championship. By the way, Chris Jericho famously defeated The Rock and Stone Cold Steve Austin in one night. Stone Cold Steve Austin had the WWF Championship. The Rock had the WCW Championship, and he defeated them in one night, unifying the WCW Championship and the WWE Championship for the first time in many years, probably since the WWE left the NWA in 1963. So, Triple H, a Royal Rumble winner in 2002. 2003, now, the end of the invasion angle, Paul Heyman is doing nothing. ECW is completely eliminated. Survivor Series 2001, the alliance is disbanded. So what does Paul Heyman do? He goes back and recruits this monster, this beast, the next big thing, Brock Lesnar. And Brock Lesnar runs roughshod over the World Wrestling Federation. He defeats The Rock for the Undisputed Championship at Nassau Coliseum in 2002. The WWE fans turn on The Rock, just like they turn on him in the Hulk Hogan match. They turn on him again in the Brock Lesnar match. They're so into this guy, Brock Lesnar. But at so much to the point that when they do a brand, now WWF has no competition. It comes WWE after WrestleMania 18. They put the F out, and because of the pressure from World Wildlife Fund, they had to change their initials. Why World Wildlife Fund and the World Wrestling Federation existed for many years before that, I don't know. But under the pressure, Vince McMahon caves in, and he decides to get the F out, and WWF becomes the WWE in 2002. So big changes in 2002. The debut of Brock Lesnar, the return of Hulk Hogan, the return of Kevin Nash, and the return of Scott Hall for a while. Big changes. But one of the bigger changes was that Raw and SmackDown become two separate brands. Now WWE has no competition. No WCW anymore, no ECW anymore. So they feel like they got to create their own competition. So Raw becomes one brand headed by Eric Bischoff, who ironically enough comes back after Vince McMahon decides to disband the NWO. And SmackDown, which is headed by by Stephanie McMahon. Now, there is only one champion, and the original idea was that the champion would appear on both brands. So Brock Lesnar becomes the champion, and the SmackDown brand decides to sign him exclusively. So, not to be outdone, Eric Bischoff has to create a championship. So Eric Bischoff brings back the big gold belt, the same big gold belt used in Jim Crockett promotions, the same big gold belt that all those years ago in 1991, Ric Flair brought out on primetime as the real world's champion. That same big gold belt, the head of the former head of the WCW, now the GM of Raw, brings back and presents to Triple H, who is now in a faction with Ric Flair. So the very same man who defeated the father of Stephanie McMahon, Vince McMahon, in real life for 83 weeks is now returning and giving that belt to Triple H to be the Raw champion, the head of his his Raw championship, his Raw brand as the champion, the on-screen protege of Ric Flair in Evolution, a faction with Randy Orton. Newcomers Randy Orton and Batista by the end of 2002. But on the SmackDown brand, it's being torn up. Brock Lesnar becomes face. The title is taken off of him, and they put it on the Big Show at the Survivor Series 2002, which is a classic event where the Elimination Chamber first appeared. Shawn Michaels wins the World Heavyweight Championship. And that one, go watch that if you have never. But Brock Lesnar is on fire, and the 2003 Royal Rumble is one that he wins. And he goes on to have that classic match with Kurt Angle, the one where he does the shooting star and almost breaks his neck. But Brock Lesnar, still on fire, goes on to win this one. Now, 2004. Now, this is WrestleMania 20. The WWF is going back to the Garden, and Shawn Michaels and Triple H are having hell of a feuds, hell of a matches ever since SummerSlam 1992. I mean SummerSlam 2002. They've been tearing it up. Those two former DX members have been killing it. They had this last man standing match at the Royal Rumble that year that was tremendous, and they still had a hell of a rivalry. But SmackDown begins to become more popular than Raw. It is SmackDown that fans are gravitating towards. It is SmackDown that fans are liking. Because on Raw, not only is Triple H an evolution, Triple H is the champion, he has evolution. He's tearing it up. He's defeating all these WCW guys that are coming in. He defeats Booker T at WrestleMania 19. He defeats Goldberg at SummerSlam 2003 Elimination Chamber match. He defeats Scott Steiner. Now, granted, the Scott Steiner match with him and Scott Steiner at Royal Rumble 2003 last year wasn't that great. But all these former WCW guys, he missed the invasion, but he went back, he backtracked, and he basically beat every former WCW guy that there was to beat. And while at the same time having the thing with him and Shawn Michaels, the feud with him and Shawn Michaels was really the only thing that really kept fans watching Raw. SmackDown with the SmackDown 6 is tearing it up. Eddie Guerrero is on there. Los Guerreros with Chavo. Edge is on there. Christian is on there. And this man, Chris Benoit, is on there. Paul Heyman is he's the booker and the on-screen GM at this time. Stephanie McMahon had been let go as the on-screen GM, and they're just tearing it up. And everybody is pulling for this guy to win and make the jump over to Raw and finally put an end to Triple H's reign of terror. And keep in mind, he's a former WCW guy. And this guy it's weird because WrestleMania 20 is kind of like WrestleMania 10. There was a guy that Vince wanted. He probably wanted Shawn Michaels to go in there and defeat Triple H for the World Heavyweight Championship, finally ending their feud. Right, but the fans wanted Chris Benoit. The fans wanted this wrestler, Chris Benoit, former WCW wrestler, to kind of get revenge for WCW. And just like WrestleMania 10, the technical wrestler who Vince really wasn't running with, just like with Bret Hart, he becomes the guy who takes it all. He becomes the guy who wins. So eliminating Big Show at the Royal Rumble 2004 is Chris Benoit. And then he would go on to face the first triple threat main event. Remember I said in Royal Rumble 1994, two guys won. And at WrestleMania, they didn't have a triple threat match. They instead had the guys, Bret Hart and Lex Luger, face Yokozuna on two separate occasions that night. This year, 2004, 10 years later, they did have a triple threat match. And Benoit ends up winning, tapping out Triple H. And it was a tremendous moment. His former Radicals tag team partner and real-life friend, who himself had just defeated Brock Lesnar, chased Brock Lesnar out of the company, basically, because Brock Lesnar had a match WrestleMania 20 against Goldberg, but it sucked, and nobody really wants to remember that. Eddie Guerrero defeats Brock Lesnar in No Way Out 2004. And he's the WWE champion. He defends the WWE championship successfully against Kurt Angle. And he comes out and hugs Chris Benoit. It was like the curtain call. Fans knew that the two guys had love for each other in real life. They had traveled down the roads with each other in real life. They were friends, best friends back during the SmackDown 6 era, and people loved that Benoit had finally achieved it. Unfortunately, this is one of the sadder Royal Rumbles because you won't find this on the Peacock Network either, because Well, Chris Benoit did what Chris Benoit did. I mean, he murdered his wife and son, Daniel Benoit, not so long after this. This was 2004. 3 years later, 2007, he would do what he did, and the Benoit tragedy was the darkest day not only in WWE's history, but in professional wrestling history in general. And WWE erased it, but I was there. I saw them when they hugged. It was a tremendous moment. It was a great moment. I had fallen asleep at the Brock Lesnar Goldberg match, and it was a shame because when Brock Lesnar came in 2 years before that, and then when he won the Royal Rumble last year, I loved him. He was one of the greatest. I continue to love him after he came back in 2012. But it's interesting to see how from one Royal Rumble, from one year to another in the Royal Rumble, just like with Ric Flair and Yokozuna, WWE was really behind Ric Flair. A year later, a couple weeks after the Royal Rumble in 1993, Ric Flair would be gone and going back to WCW just like this. Brock wins the Royal Rumble, and then a year later, Brock would be gone from the company to go to the NFL and later to the UFC. So things can change from a year. But for this year, 2004 was Chris Benoit's year. 2000, the winner of the 2004 Royal Rumble was Chris Benoit. Now, 2005, this is a funny one. And it's funny because of what happened during it. There was some issues where Vince McMahon had come down. He tore both his quads, and he's sitting in the middle of the ring, telling the referee to restart it. It comes down to Cena and Batista. Now, what's the story with Batista? Well, in the summer of 2004, the group Evolution, which was the present Triple H, the past Ric Flair, and the future Batista and Randy Orton, had broken up. Randy Orton had gone on his own. He defeated Chris Benoit at SummerSlam that year to win the World Heavyweight Championship. His babyface push, and he was supposed to be the guy that Evolution would turn on their version of Sting, basically. Because just like when the Four Horsemen turned on Sting, Sting had a #1 contendership at the Great American Bash against Ric Flair. They told Sting, listen, you cannot be in the Four Horsemen and go against Ric Flair. You got to give it to Ric Flair. He's the leader of the Four Horsemen. Evolution basically told Randy Orton the same thing, where he could not be the World Heavyweight Champion and hold the World Heavyweight Championship. It had to go to Triple H. Evolution was all for Triple H, was built around Triple H, and Triple H gave the thumbs down. Evolution pretended like they were happy for Randy, and then he gave the thumbs down. Then they beat up Randy Orton, and eventually Triple H would go on to defeat Randy Orton. And by 2005, we were back where we started. Triple H once again the World Heavyweight Champion. But his second Evolution partner, Batista, would win this Royal Rumble and be your 2005 Royal Rumble winner. John Cena, also on SmackDown, had been in the ascendancy. At WrestleMania 20, he had defeated The Big Show to win the U.S. Championship. He had a great U.S. Championship feud with Carlito, and then really come into his own on SmackDown. He would face off against JBL, ending JBL's reign as the longest champion in SmackDown history. And he would be the star of the following year's WrestleMania. But for this Royal Rumble and this WrestleMania, Batista's choice was to go against Triple H. So he was basically following the same path that Randy Orton was following. Randy Orton turned against Evolution and won the World Heavyweight Championship. Batista was now doing the same thing. So he's the winner of the 2005 Royal Rumble. Also, in 2005, Eddie Guerrero and Rey Mysterio had rekindled their feud from 1997. In 1997, Rey Mysterio and Eddie Guerrero had a tremendous um, program together. Halloween Havoc 1997, one of their best ever matches. Now WCW is closed. Rey Mysterio comes over to the WWE in 2002. And it took them a while, but they got the program between Eddie Guerrero and Rey Mysterio started again. WrestleMania 21 classic match, one of the best matches on the card later that year. And they went on to have their 2005 ladder match for the custody the custody of Rey Mysterio's son Dominic. Now it's pretty stupid having a wrestling match for the custody of a kid. Like, who can forget that graphic of Dominic in the middle between them? But it came up with a classic shirt, "I'm Your Poppy." But unfortunately, um, in the latter half of 2005, Eddie Guerrero would pass away. And people kind of knew that Eddie Guerrero and Rey Mysterio were friends in real life. So heading into Royal Rumble 2006, people were using Eddie Guerrero's name and likeness, you know, to bolster Rey Mysterio winning the Royal Rumble and winning the World Heavyweight Championship, even to the point where this is a promo I really didn't agree with, and I really stopped watching the WWE in 2006. One of the reasons was because of this. Randy Orton, the World Heavyweight Champion at that time, said this promo, "Eddie Guerrero's not in heaven, Eddie is in hell." So I'm like, wait a minute, you're basically exploiting the death of Eddie Guerrero for a wrestling angle. How fucked up is that? Another reason I stopped watching WWE in 2006 was because of the stuff that Vince McMahon would do in his angle against Shawn Michaels, where he would claim to be better than God. And he even had was basically a handicap match between Shawn Michaels teaming with God versus Vince McMahon. Like, WWE really went offensive in 2006, and I was just turned off. But anyway, the result of the 2006 Royal Rumble was Rey Mysterio winning his Cinderella story, if you will, and continuing his feud with Randy Orton. It should have just been him and Randy Orton instead of, okay, you throw Kurt Angle in the mix. Well, why Kurt Angle? But he goes on in a triple threat match to win the World Heavyweight Championship against Randy Orton, riding that Eddie Guerrero wave. Now, by 2007, Batista has switched to SmackDown after he won the World Heavyweight Championship. He brought the World Heavyweight Championship to SmackDown, and he had been the World Heavyweight Champion for several times. And it was like, who was going to stop Batista? Who was going to stop the Animal Batista? Well, one person who had never won the Royal Rumble, and he'd been in several, even had a famous incident where he died at one Royal Rumble, the Royal Rumble 1994, in a casket match against Yokozuna, was The Undertaker. The Undertaker had never, ever in his whole career since being with the WWE, ever won the Royal Rumble. So finally, he does. And there's this moment in the Royal Rumble 2007 where it comes down to him and Shawn Michaels. And we know the history with those two. First Hell in a Cell match, at the Royal Rumble in a casket match, was Undertaker who actually retired Shawn Michaels. So there's a story between them. And before they wrestled each other at Ground Zero 97, they had never wrestled each other ever before. But anyway, the story of this was this WrestleMania 23, besides the Trump stuff, Battle of the Billionaires, Trump in the corner, Bobby Lashley, and Vince McMahon in the corner of Umaga, with Stone Cold Steve Austin as a special referee. Besides that, the story of this um, WrestleMania was going to be Batista versus Undertaker, like two clashes of the Titans. And for the first time ever, Undertaker 2007 is the Royal Rumble winner. And he goes on to face um, Batista at WrestleMania 23, and he wins the World Heavyweight Championship from Batista, becoming the undisputed King of SmackDown. At this point, fast forward to 2008. Now Edge is on SmackDown. He actually cost The Undertaker the World Heavyweight Championship, and he's on SmackDown. And he is becoming a huge pain in the ass of everybody. So it eventually leads to a match for the World Heavyweight Championship between him and Undertaker at WrestleMania 24. But what about the WWE Championship? Cena had been dominant. Cena had two reigns, even defeated Rob Van Dam. Rob Van Dam defeated him at One Night Stand 06. The fans were all against him in the Hammerstein Ballroom. Cena got tremendous heat, but then RVD cashing his money in the bank from WrestleMania 22, and RVD gets suspended because of drugs, and then the title is stripped from RVD, and Cena gets it. Cena then gets it back. But then Cena is injured in a feud with Randy Orton in 2007. So he's taken off TV. And Randy Orton and Jeff Hardy kind of have a trade-off of the championships. But it's whatever. Randy Orton is ruling the roost. He is now on Raw. He is ruling the Raw division as the WWE Championship. And Cena is out. And this was the beginning of the Cena haters. Like, Cena's dominance had been so much that now WWE fans were turning against Cena. It started in his feud with Triple H at WrestleMania 22, where Triple H was just basically berating him. It then went on to his feud with Randy Orton, SummerSlam 2007, where fans actually chanted, "You can't wrestle" at Cena. Like, WWE was really pushing Cena, but fans were not really going for Cena. So being that he was out, the division really suffered. Jeff Hardy had a chance to become a huge star at this time, but the division really suffered, and people just needed him back. And at this Royal Rumble 2008, it was in Madison Square Garden. Again, I wasn't there, but I was watching it on TV. And Cena comes out at number 30, surprise entrant. The crowd goes wild, but then they remember that it's Cena and they hate Cena, so they start to boo him. Roddy Piper was there, Jimmy Snuka was there. It was a huge salute to the old legends of professional wrestling in the 80s, WWF in the 80s. But Randy Orton actually retains the title at WrestleMania 24. Again, in a triple threat match against Triple H and Cena. So, even though John Cena wins the Royal Rumble in 2008, he does not go on to win the WWE Championship. This WrestleMania 2008, WrestleMania 24, featured the return of the Big Show and the whole hype. They're trying to recreate the Tyson and Austin thing with the Big Show and Floyd Mayweather, because Floyd Mayweather the year before had the biggest pay-per-view buy rate in all of pay-per-view history in his match against De La Hoya. So they're trying to recreate that. Keep in mind, WWE wants some mainstream cachet behind them. After the Chris Benoit tragedy in 2007, all they had was bad press, so they tried to bring Mayweather in to try and get some of that mainstream success. 50 Cent was supposed to accompany Mayweather down the aisle singing a song, but that didn't end up happening. But Mayweather and Big Show, they had a kind of a good match, but the match that really stole the show was Ric Flair's retirement against Shawn Michaels. But anyway, John Cena wins Royal Rumble in 2008. Now, Randy Orton retained the title at WrestleMania 24, but he would have an okay year. Triple H then switched to SmackDown. He feuds with Edge. He feuds with Randy Orton a little. But towards the end of the year, Randy Orton forms a faction of his own, just like Triple H was leader of Revolution. Now Randy Orton is now a leader of a group with him, Cody Rhodes, and Ted DiBiase Jr., and they're known as Legacy. Originally, it was including Jimmy Snuka's son from Deuce and Domino, and but that goes nowhere. So it was just narrowed down to Ted DiBiase Jr. and Cody Rhodes, and Randy Orton is on a roll, and it is Randy Orton that wins the Royal Rumble in 2009, going on to face Triple H at WrestleMania 25. Now, this match, even though they had a good lead up to it, with Triple H invading Randy Orton's home and all this shit, even though it was and then Randy Orton kissing Stephanie McMahon, them coming on and finally revealing, yes, Stephanie McMahon and Triple H are still together, even though they broke up publicly in the lead into WrestleMania 18. WWE, by the time WrestleMania 25 rolls around, they're like, fuck it, they're still together in real life. Randy Orton kisses Stephanie McMahon. This match ends up being overshadowed by a match that really started the year before. The build-up was the year before. The build-up, just like with Hogan and Warrior, the build-up was at 2 years before. Royal Rumble 2007, Shawn Michaels and The Undertaker. That was the match that ended up stealing the show at WrestleMania 25. Not Randy Orton's match, in which he didn't even win. He won the Royal Rumble, but he didn't win the match at WrestleMania 25. Triple H walks out of there successfully. Now, with Edge. Edge has the feud with The Undertaker. He is chokeslammed to hell in SummerSlam 2008. And he goes off TV. Eventually, he starts to team with himself and Chris Jericho, and he gets injured. And just like with all other injuries, when he finally comes back, it'll be a huge deal, and it is at Royal Rumble 2010. Edge wins and actually goes on to face Chris Jericho for the World Heavyweight the World Heavyweight Championship. So the year before, he's the heel, and Undertaker is the babyface. He's the champion, and Undertaker is the challenger. Now he's the challenger, and Chris Jericho, his former tag team partner, is the champion. And they had a pretty good match, but Edge is your 2010 Royal Rumble winner. 2010 was pretty underwhelming. Now, 2011, who's the guy in 2011? Well, WWE is trying to become more international in the late 2010 because they began to lose a lot of viewers during this time period. So they branch out to Mexico. So they want to really reach out to Mexican performers. So, 2010, the winner is Alberto Del Rio, and Alberto Del Rio would then go on at WrestleMania 27 to challenge Edge for the World Heavyweight Championship in the opening match that year in 2011, and that would kind of be Edge's last WrestleMania match. But Alberto Del Rio is your 2011 Royal Rumble winner, and a guy that makes his WrestleMania debut at two SummerSlams ago against Triple H, one of Triple H's workout buddies. Again, I said they're reaching out internationally. Well, the same way they're reaching out internationally to, say, Mexico with Del Rio, they're also reaching out internationally to Ireland. And the guy they get in Ireland is the Celtic Warrior Sheamus, who ends up being your 2012 Royal Rumble winner and ends up beating Daniel Bryan in a matter of seconds for the World Heavyweight Championship. Who can forget it? That sort of began Daniel Bryan's evolution that would find him at the center of WrestleMania 30 2 years later. Daniel Bryan would begin his evolution with the Yes Movement, but he never wins a Royal Rumble. But anyway, that's a whole nother story. But he does have a big moment at WrestleMania 30, which I'll be getting to. But Sheamus is your Royal Rumble winner for 2012. 2013, now, at 2011, a guy that comes back after being gone for 7 years from the WWE is The Rock. The Rock, during the time he was gone from the WWE, 2004 was his last match. Him and Mankind going against the members of Evolution, the three members of Evolution. So basically, The Rock did face Ric Flair at a WrestleMania. It wasn't one-on-one, but it was what it was. That was his last match. And one of the few times after we see him on WWE TV until 2011, when he came back as the guest host of WrestleMania for WrestleMania 27. Kind of to spice it up, The Miz versus John Cena really wasn't doing it, and Edge versus Alberto Del Rio. Del Rio, keep in mind, that won the Royal Rumble that year, really wasn't doing it either, so they needed some kind of spice. There were rumors that Justin Bieber would be the guest host because Bieber was blowing up with, songs such as Baby and One Last Lonely Girl for like the following 2 years, but it wasn't him. He was kind of loved and hated at the same time. It was really weird. But it wasn't Justin Bieber, it was The Rock. And then the night after WrestleMania 27, The Rock announces that the next year he will take on John Cena, who's somebody that dissed him publicly. Like, one thing Cena started to say when The Rock came in around 2008-ish to induct his father and grandfather into the Hall of Fame, that he never comes back to WWE and he never pays homage to his roots where he started. Ironically, Cena doesn't do that now, and he talks that shit about The Rock doing that back then. But he does the same thing now. But anyway, he doesn't. The Rock doesn't return for years and years, and Cena actually went on a lot of these late shows and dissed The Rock. So finally, when The Rock does come back, he cost Cena the match. The Miz retains the WWE Championship at WrestleMania 27. And the night after on Raw, it's announced that at WrestleMania 28 in Miami, Florida, The Rock's hometown, Rock will be returning to the ring in the once-in-a-lifetime match against John Cena. So, meaning both the WWE Championship match, CM Punk's match against Chris Jericho, and the World Heavyweight title match, Sheamus's match against Daniel Bryan, Sheamus, the winner of the 2012 Royal Rumble, will be put on the back burner and it's the highest buy rate that WWE has ever done. The Once in a Lifetime match, 2012, and it was a tremendous night. Machine Gun Kelly was there, Flo Rida was there for the first time ever in WWE. Wouldn't be the last. But anyway, a lot of people were there for WrestleMania 12. I mean, WrestleMania 28 in 2012. People that hadn't followed the WWE since Rock's last run in the Attitude Era were once again following the WWE. So WWE wanted to capitalize on that success by having The Rock and John Cena again at WrestleMania 29. They were coming back to New York City, the New York City area, MetLife Stadium. So they wanted to have something big, but they wanted to raise the stakes this time. For 200 and plus days since winning it at Madison Square Garden in Survivor Series 2011 against Del Rio, CM Punk had been the WWE champion. He had his heel run. After his pipe bomb, he dropped on John Cena and he dropped on The Rock. And he was aligned with Paul Heyman and he was on top of the world. But unfortunately, he only gets a match with The Undertaker at WrestleMania 29, while John Cena and The Rock happens again for the WWE Championship. The Rock has a feud with him because of his pipe bomb comments. The Rock ends his historic 200 plus day run at the Royal Rumble 2013. But who wins the Royal Rumble in 2013? John Cena, setting up John Cena versus The Rock Part 2. So they have their match. Of course, Cena gets his win back. Cena wins not only the Royal Rumble, but goes on to win the WWE Championship. Now the WWE Championship is a different design. The belt design that we see today is basically what it is. But I was there for this, and let me tell you that the match between CM Punk and Undertaker was the match that everybody really looked forward to. It was the match that everybody wanted to see. It was the match that made the show. Cena and The Rock, the WWE wanted to capitalize on it because it was so successful in 2012. They thought it would be, again, successful the next year. It wasn't. It fell flat. So even though John Cena wins his second Royal Rumble, coming back to the New York City area, winning the WWE Championship, it falls flat and it sucked. And so did Brock Lesnar's return against Triple H to the Garden. Well, this wasn't the Garden, this was MetLife Stadium, but to the New York City area. WWE's home. The main event fell flat, but John Cena won the 2013 Royal Rumble. So when it comes to returns and people that had left the company to go mainstream and done a lot of things, one of those guys that did that after he left the company in 2010 was Batista. He had gone to Marvel and he had been a success in Marvel. Just like The Rock had been a success in Hollywood or Brock Lesnar had been a success in UFC, Batista had been that same thing in Hollywood. So he's coming back in 2014. They announced Batista has come back. So immediately when they announced Batista is coming back, we automatically assume, and we assume correctly, that Batista is going to win the 2014 Royal Rumble, and he does. But since SummerSlam 2013, well, barely before that, since he lost against Sheamus at WrestleMania 28, the fans kind of got behind Daniel Bryan and this whole movement where he would chant, yes, yes, after he wins, the match, acting like he He's like he just won the Super Bowl. He would chant, yes, yes. And since SummerSlam 2013, when Triple H was the referee, and even though Daniel wins the match, Randy Orton then comes in and cashes money in the bank with Triple H's help. Now Triple H and Randy Orton are united again in the Authority because the fans perceived that the company was trying to hold Daniel Bryan back. So both in kayfabe on TV and in real life, the company was holding Daniel Bryan back, saying that he was a B+ player, saying that he wasn't good enough to be in the main event. They even um, parroting what was going on in real life, the Occupy Wall Street movement. They organized the Occupy WWE movement. And people even walked out on Triple H, who was the COO of the company, on screen, in protest of Daniel Bryan not getting the fair treatment. So people wanted Daniel Bryan to win the 2014 Royal Rumble, but he doesn't. Batista does, and the match is Batista versus Randy Orton for the WWE Championship at WrestleMania 30, right? But fans, again, don't want to see that, just like they didn't want to see another Shawn Michaels versus Triple H match 10 years before, or they didn't want to see a Lex Luger versus Yokozuna rematch with Lex Luger winning the WWF Championship 20 years before. In 2014, WrestleMania 30, the first WrestleMania where WWE is now off of pay-per-view, launching their own internet-based network. They don't want to see Batista versus Randy Orton. They're two of Triple H's buddies, two guys in the quote-unquote Breakfast Club. They don't want to see Batista going to win the WWE Championship. Now united under one brand. The brand split had ended earlier on in the previous year. So now the WWE Championship and the World Heavyweight Championship are under one banner. And they just don't want to see that. Again, just like in WrestleMania 10 and just like in WrestleMania 20, they're going against the grain and they're going with the smaller, more technically based wrestler. But I say unlike, they're not going with the pre-approved match that Vince McMahon and them want. And again, it's two different challengers. This time it's Batista and Randy Orton. Last time was Triple H and Shawn Michaels. The time before that, it was Lex Luger and Yokozuna. And Bret Hart defeated all the odds. Bret Hart went on to win the WWF Championship. Chris Benoit defeated all the odds and went on to win the World Heavyweight Championship against Triple H and Shawn Michaels. Daniel Bryan, now with the Yes Movement, was going on to defy all the odds and defeat Randy Orton and Batista. But Batista wins the Royal Rumble, but because of that injustice, WWE feels like they have to go back and give it to Daniel Bryan. And it was one of the greatest WrestleMania moments of all time. Unfortunately, I think it was overshadowed by Brock Lesnar defeating The Undertaker to end his WrestleMania streak, becoming the one in 21-1, and kind of overshadowed over the whole week by newest WWE Hall of Famer inductee, The Ultimate Warrior, passing away. But Daniel Bryan and his dedication to Connor McCullough, Connor the Crusher, was one of the achieving moments, the Yes movement. And that whole thing is something I will never forget. But it's interesting how WrestleMania 10, WrestleMania 20, and WrestleMania 30 kind of have these parallel storylines of the smaller technical wrestler that WWE doesn't really want going against these two more popular wrestlers that WWE had been pushing and pushing, finally overcoming. And he beats him with a yes lock, which is basically a crippler crossface. And he makes Batista tap out. How poetic. But Batista is the 2014 Royal Rumble winner. Now, 2015, Daniel Bryan wins. Big ovation, big celebration. But unfortunately, he gets injured. And WWE is not going for another Chris Benoit. They're not going to have another Chris Benoit on their hands with tremendous head injuries and having Daniel Bryan, be concussed and, God forbid, do something terrible. So they make Daniel Bryan go out of commission. People say that the plan was to have him and Brock Lesnar at that year's SummerSlam, and Brock was going to beat him anyway. Brock ends up beating the shit out of Cena, and that's really where Suplex City and all that shit really starts in the match. In the match against Cena, Brock begins his dominance. SummerSlam 2014. But we don't know because Daniel Bryan is taken out of the equation. During this time, ex-Shield member Roman Reigns begins to dominate. He began at the Royal Rumble 2014. He was dominating in the way that Diesel was in the Royal Rumble 1994. Diesel was dominating at the Royal Rumble 1994 and would be on top in 1995. Roman Reigns, the same thing. Royal Rumble 2014, he was dominating, and he would be on top in the Royal Rumble 2015. But people wanted Daniel Bryan to come back, and people wanted to finally see Daniel Bryan win the freaking Royal Rumble and go on to WrestleMania 31 and face Brock Lesnar as the champion and win. But that doesn't happen. Roman Reigns in Philadelphia. This is another one I'll never forget. Even though I wasn't really watching it necessarily that night, but seeing the reaction after, because I was in the hospital, but seeing the reaction after, and I came back out of the hospital, and seeing the reaction to Roman Reigns' first Royal Rumble win, that even though The Rock came out, The Rock, the most popular wrestler ever, Roman Reigns' cousin, coming out and, raising his hand, even that wasn't enough for the fans to cheer for Roman Reigns. Thankfully, it wasn't clear-cut, textbook clear-cut and dry, where Roman Reigns goes on to face Brock Lesnar and wins against Brock Lesnar because Seth Rollins at the last minute of WrestleMania 31 cashes Money in the Bank briefcase, and he walks out of WrestleMania as the champion. Thankfully, that happened because nobody really wanted to see Roman Reigns, the winner of the 2015 Royal Rumble, walk out of that year's WrestleMania as the champion. So, the following year, well, unfortunately, Roman Reigns does eventually become the champion again. And it goes down to a storyline where he is facing off against Sheamus. Sheamus then cashes Money in the Bank against Roman, defeats Roman, and people are knowing that they are pushing for Roman Reigns again. Roman Reigns comes back, defeats Sheamus. Now, Roman is going in to the Royal Rumble 2016 as the champion and putting up the title at the Royal Rumble. So the winner of the once again, like 1992, the winner of the 2016 Royal Rumble will be the champion. So who's Roman's main adversary? Now that WWE has switched the animosity of the Authority from Daniel Bryan, who is now retired, who retired in the early part of 2016. He's now retired. So they've switched their animosity after the Survivor Series, after they cost Roman the championship from Sheamus. They've switched their animosity to Roman Reigns. So they had Roman Reigns arrested on one of the Raws and everything. And they're really stacking the deck against Roman Reigns. They're going back to the well, doing what they did against Stone Cold Steve Austin. Going back to the well and using, and what they did against Daniel Bryan, going back to the well, using that tactic of having the authority, the heads of the company, Triple H, Vince McMahon, and Stephanie McMahon, attacking Roman Reigns and really stacking the deck against Roman Reigns to the point where they have Roman Reigns put the title up against 30 other men, and put a title up against all the WWE superstars at the Royal Rumble 2016, in which he loses and Triple H is your winner, your 2016 Royal Rumble. Now, Triple H will go on at WrestleMania 32, Levi's Stadium, one of the biggest attended WrestleManias ever, to be defeated by Roman Reigns. And that was really the point, because keep in mind, last year when Roman won the Royal Rumble and went on to face Brock, he didn't defeat Brock, but he did this year. He did in 2016. That was really the point where they launched Roman Reigns. And that was also when they switched from calling the female superstars divas to calling them superstars, and they launched the careers of Becky Lynch, Sasha Banks, and Charlotte Flair. More on that later. Now, 2017, one of the people that was launched during this new network era was Bray Wyatt. And one of the enemies of Bray Wyatt, one of the main on-screen adversaries of Bray Wyatt, was Randy Orton. Bray Wyatt goes on to win the championship at Elimination Chamber that year. But Randy Orton is your 2017 Royal Rumble winner. At this point, WrestleMania 33, WrestleMania is so stacked that even the winner of the Royal Rumble, Randy Orton, who wins his second Royal Rumble, goes on to defeat Bray Wyatt for the WWE Championship. It is not even the main event. Actually, Roman Reigns' match against Undertaker is the real main event, but thankfully Roman Reigns doesn't win the Royal Rumble. It's Randy Orton. Now, people are saying Randy Orton, Triple H, Roman Reigns, too many old faces, right? So they want somebody new. They want somebody different. And the somebody different that they want in 2018 is Shinsuke Nakamura. Shinsuke Nakamura had been a star in New Japan Pro Wrestling. He had really electrified the fans in his matches against, on NXT. And people were looking for something different. So that's exactly what they gave him in 2018's Royal Rumble, when Shinsuke Nakamura won the Royal Rumble that year. Now, keep in mind what I said. They had launched the new women's division with the girls from NXT. They were tearing it up in NXT, and just like Nakamura, they were getting a lot of attention. So, what does WWE do? They have a women's Royal Rumble. And in that women's Royal Rumble is another undefeated phenomenon of the NXT division, Asuka. She becomes the first woman Royal Rumble winner 30 years after, to the date of the year that the Royal Rumble is launched, Royal Rumble 2018. Keep in mind, Royal Rumble was launched in 1988. So the men's Royal Rumble. Now they launched the women's Royal Rumble, the first women's Royal Rumble, and two Japanese superstars who really aren't good on the mic because they only really speak Japanese win the Royal Rumble in 2018. Who makes her debut that year? former UFC champion, media sensation, media legend Ronda Rousey and her debut match, teaming up against the returning Kurt Angle, who's returning from TNA to face Stephanie McMahon and Triple H in a mixed tag, overshadows Asuka's match against Charlotte Flair. And she, at the Royal Rumble that year, points to the WrestleMania sign. She is going on to WrestleMania 34 in New Orleans, Louisiana. Now, it would have been cool if she'd have challenged Asuka, but that didn't happen, not that year. 2019. Now, Roman Reigns, unfortunately, in 2019, he was a big factor in 2018. He had his rematch against Brock Lesnar. He didn't win, but he's out of the equation. He's the main star of WWE in this era, but he's out of the equation because he announced in the last part of 2018 that his leukemia had come back and he was out of commission. So he knew he wasn't going to win the 2019 Royal Rumble. But who's the next best? Who's the next up? Seth Rollins. And that's exactly who wins the 2019 Royal Rumble, who would go on to face Brock Lesnar at WrestleMania 35 in New York. Now, Ronda Rousey, she debuts at WrestleMania 34. She has a kind of tremendous year. Then she really brings the focus to the WWE Women's Division. Yes, Sasha was doing it up. Becky Lynch was doing it up. Bayley was doing it up. Asuka, all of those, Nia Jax, all these other women. But it was Ronda Rousey and her mainstream appeal. Again, mainstream, just like with Mr. T, just like what they try to do with LT, just like what they did with Mike Tyson. Again, mainstream exposure is really bringing some, and they try to do it with Mayweather back in 2008. Mainstream exposure is bringing eyeballs back to the product of WWE for the first time ever in the women's division. They had Asuka win the first Royal Rumble, but now Ronda Rousey, who debuted the year before, is tearing it up in the women's division. So much so that she is having this intense rivalry with Becky Lynch. They were supposed to face each other at the Survivor Series in 2018. That ended up not happening because Becky Lynch's face was completely destroyed by Nia Jax, and organically, the fans began to cheer for Becky Lynch. They began to call her the man. It's a groundswelling of support again, just like it was for Benoit, just like it was for Bret Hart, just like it was for Daniel Bryan, for Becky Lynch. To finally take the belt off Ronda and defeat Ronda. And it's also a groundswelling for the WrestleMania 35 main event, going back to the New York City area to be a women's main event. To be, for the first time ever, WrestleMania to feature women in the match. So Becky Lynch wins the 2019 Royal Rumble for the women, and Ronda Rousey and Charlotte Flair. I didn't really like Charlotte Flair being in the match. I thought that was kind of lame. I made a video on it the night it happened when she defeated Asuka for the SmackDown Women's Championship. I'm like, why are they shoehorning her in? At the last minute, it should have just been Becky Lynch and Ronda Rousey, but more on that later. And for the men, it was Seth Rollins. He does end up defeating Brock Lesnar. Whatever. Fortunately, Roman Reigns does come back, and he does wrestle at WrestleMania 35. He makes his return after he battles with his leukemia. And at WrestleMania 35, he takes on Drew McIntyre. Now, that leads us into WrestleMania 36 and the Royal Rumble 2020. Now, Royal Rumble 2020. Drew McIntyre had done his thing. He'd come back after he was laid off in 2014. He went to the Indies. He became this huge star. The famous layoff in 2014, and just like Jinder Mahal, he he'd established himself on the Indies, and he finally come back, and he finally climbed his way up to the ladder, and the fans were really pulling for him to win the 2020 Royal Rumble. And Brock Lesnar, who was the champion at that time, had decided to enter the Royal Rumble, not to put the title on the line like Roman Reigns had done in 2016, but to just enter the Royal Rumble. So people were like, who's gonna win? Brock Lesnar, McIntyre, who's gonna end up taking it? And Drew McIntyre wins the event. Now, and does go on to WrestleMania 36 to face Brock Lesnar. Now, that was in January. By the time we moved to March, COVID-19 hits. Now, COVID-19 is unprecedented. We're still dealing with it to this day, 2 years later, 2022. It was unprecedented. It even impacted professional wrestling. It limited the capacity to zero. And, you know, you couldn't have more than 10 people congregating. All live events were banned. It was just a surreal time, 2020. Everything was shut down, major shutdowns around the world, and professional wrestling was no exception. So they ended up having to have WrestleMania 36 in the Performance Center. And when Drew McIntyre, the 2020 Royal Rumble winner, goes on to defeat Brock Lesnar, it's in the Performance Center with no audience. So he had his moment. He finally climbed up the ladder of success, and he finally had his match with Brock Lesnar. But because of what we were going through, what the world was going through at that time, COVID-19 was really big, was really hitting the United States, especially hard around the time of March of WrestleMania. We couldn't really see Drew McIntyre really crowned as the WWE champion. But he does win the 2020 Royal Rumble. And it is bears mentioning that that same night was the night that NBA legend, Laker Kobe Bryant, and his daughter Gianna died in a plane crash the night of Royal Rumble 2020. So there was some tribute paid to him that night. And for the women, Charlotte Flair won, and she went on to challenge NXT champion Rhea Ripley for the belts. First time ever that a Royal Rumble winner. The Royal Rumble gets the Royal Rumble winner gets their choice of 3 women to face, and Charlotte's pick was Rhea Ripley. So, as I said, WrestleMania 36 was really surreal. They started these cinematic matches between John Cena comes back and he faces The Fiend in a cinematic match. AJ Styles faces The Undertaker, and what is The Undertaker's final match to date at WrestleMania 36. No audience, so they had to overcompensate with these cinematic matches. But I just thought it was really weird to have Brock Lesnar in the match at the Royal Rumble. But of course, they were setting up him and Drew McIntyre. But I felt really bad for Drew because, I wanted to see him crowned. Well, I didn't really like him, but I feel like if they're going to launch a champion, they might as well launch him in a big way. Somebody new, like they did Stone Cold Steve Austin, or they did Shawn Michaels, or they've done with other wrestlers, Brock Lesnar himself. They launched him in a big way when he beat Angle in 2003. He went on to win the championship. So they couldn't really do that with Drew because of COVID. Plans change, as Jay Meltzer would say. It was unfortunate, but hey, Drew McIntyre held it down almost the entire COVID era. We get around to, but besides Kobe Bryant's death, another thing that had happened at the Royal Rumble 2020, Edge had returned, being gone from the company since 2011. Um, his public retirements, people felt really bad for him. People thought they would never see Edge again. But he returns, Royal Rumble 2011. He has kind of a good showing in a way. But I felt like during that match, and I have a video reviewing Royal Rumble 2020 on here, I felt like they were kind of being light with Edge because they really didn't want to injure him. But he went on to have a tremendous match with former RKO tag team, rated RKO tag team partner Randy Orton at the cinematic WrestleMania. I called it the cinematic WrestleMania. Again, overcompensating for no audience. So they had Falls Count Anywhere match, which basically amounted to an empty arena match, kind of like what The Rock and Mankind had in their Super Bowl Sunday match in 1999. Or even going back to the 70s with Jerry Lawler and Terry Funk had. So they kind of innovated. But Edge had his big moment, his big return, Royal Rumble 2020. But I felt he should have won. And that's exactly what happened at the Royal Rumble 2021. Royal Rumble 2021. He comes back. He returns. And this is his moment. This is his real moment because this is when he wins the Royal Rumble. And he goes on to face Roman Reigns and Daniel Bryan at WrestleMania 37 in a triple threat match. Now, all of these guys had their Raw moments where they had to announce something sad. Roman in 2018, Edge in 2011, and Daniel Bryan in 2016. So that kind of made the story really unique. But Edge, your 2021 Royal Rumble winner, and in the women's division, it was Bianca Belair. The story was basically during 2020, in April of 2020, was the death of George Floyd, this man who was innocently taken apart in front of the entire world with the police officer in Minnesota, Derek Chauvin, with his knee on the neck of George Floyd. And it caused a huge backlash against basically white supremacy and white society during that. So just like with COVID, WWE responded to that by promoting and pushing more African American stars. Bobby Lashley, who was now the champion, going against Drew McIntyre at WrestleMania 37, and Bianca Belair winning the 2021 Royal Rumble against, and will go on to face Sasha Banks in the first ever Royal Rumble. First ever Women's Royal Rumble won by an African American woman, in the first ever co-main event for the WWE Women's Championship. Two black women in the main event, Sasha Banks and Bianca Belair. Bianca Belair would go on to defeat Sasha Banks, and they would have a tremendous match that I'll never forget, with Bianca Belair whipping Sasha Banks with the side of her hair. It was a tremendous hair whip, a tremendous psychology. Sasha Banks had gone on to achieve mainstream success on Disney Plus's The Mandalorian Season 2 as Koshka Reeves. And she continues to excel mainstream. When I first got on here and she first was transferred to the roster in 2016, I said, push Sasha. I was really upset that she didn't go on to WrestleMania 32 and win the Women's Championship. I wish she had. I was behind her. Snoop Dogg coming out doing her song, but she went away. She came back as a heel, and then her and Bailey launched the women's tag team division. She did more than she could, and her and Bailey held it down as the golden role models during the COVID era. So finally, seeing her get her flowers and go on to the main event, WrestleMania 37 with Bianca Belair, was a tremendous thing. Again, I feel like this and Bobby Lashley walking out of WrestleMania 37 was a response to the thing that was going on, the resurgence of the BLM movement because of the death of George Floyd and all the racial conflicts that are going on. And plus, the fact that we now had a African American, half Asian woman in the White House as the vice president going into Royal Rumble 2021 made a difference as well. And the audience finally came back at WrestleMania. They weren't there for the Royal Rumble. They did the Thunderdome thing that they had started doing around SummerSlam of last year, where they have fans tune in through the computer screen because the Performance Center era from last year's WrestleMania had gotten old. So that was that. The EST of the WWE, Bianca Belair and Sasha Banks making history, and Edge coming back to face Daniel Bryan and Roman Reigns for the men's championship. Unfortunately, Edge did not win. Roman Reigns continued his dominance as a heel, the tribal chief with Paul Heyman in his corner. And that was that. But Bianca Belair did win. Unfortunately, it didn't end well for her at SummerSlam when Becky Lynch came back. But that's another story. The Royal Rumble 2022, the one that just passed. Well, the story behind that is, like I said, Brock Lesnar left the WWE after WrestleMania 36. He lost to Drew McIntyre. And there was some speculation, would he go, just like when Sasha took her time off, there was speculation after WrestleMania 35, would she go to AEW, which was Cody Rhodes' new company that he had started. So there was the same kind of speculation with Lesnar. Would he leave WWE again and go to UFC? Was UFC even going to take him back after the steroid incident in 2016? There was like UFC 200, he defeats Mark Hunt, and then UFC suspends him, and he hasn't been in UFC since. Right, so was he going to go back to UFC, probably face John Jones, who was moving up to heavyweight, or was he going to come back to the WWE? Was he going to go to Cody Rhodes' new promotion, AEW? People really didn't think he'd go to AEW, but there was some speculation. Fast forward to SummerSlam 2021. He does come back. At the end of the John Cena Roman Reigns match, he comes back, he confronts Roman Reigns. So now Paul Heyman is faced with a dilemma. Paul Heyman's dilemma is, does he side with his new protege, Roman Reigns, who's been on fire since he came back the year before at SummerSlam 2020, or does he go with his old Brock Lesnar? So is he a tribal counsel, or is he an advocate, as Roman Reigns would eloquently say? Well, the answer we thought was that he was back with Brock Lesnar, but at the Royal Rumble 2022, that proved not to be true. He actually cost Brock Lesnar the WWE Championship. Brock Lesnar come back and defeated Big E. So enough for that whole African American push, I guess. Just like when Kofi Kingston won it, when Brock Lesnar comes back, you get the belt to Brock Lesnar. No questions asked, especially when he comes back with this whole new look, wearing overalls and shit. You get the belt to Brock Lesnar. So That's that. Just like when Becky Lynch came back, you get the belt for Becky Lynch, and like enough with this pushing of a racial agenda or whatever. WWE decided to move on from that. So Brock Lesnar comes back, defeats Big E, and he's gonna face Bobby Lashley. But Paul Heyman cost Brock Lesnar the championship, and he does decide with Roman Reigns, who retains the Universal Championship. His former Shield partner Seth Rollins does defeat him, but doesn't win the Universal Championship. So, where does this leave the 2022 Royal Rumble? Brock Lesnar goes on to win the 2022, Royal Rumble. His second Royal Rumble win in his history in the WWE. And now it is unclear who he will face at WrestleMania. Most people think coming up WrestleMania 38, he will face Roman Reigns. But we don't know. So that means he will be going against Roman Reigns for the Universal Championship. He may just face Bobby Lashley in a rematch from the Royal Rumble. We don't know. So with the women, Becky Lynch comes back. She is dominant. She defeats Bianca Belair, and she is at SummerSlam. A lot of people are upset about it because, again, this push towards social justice, racial justice, they feel like WWE was representing it. Now they're not. Now they put the belt on Becky. Fans were a little bit outraged. So people are not really liking Becky Lynch anymore. But the person who comes back, a blast from Becky Lynch's past, the person that 3 years ago she defeated at WrestleMania to win the WWE Championship. Both championships, Raw and SmackDown. She became Becky Two Belts. Is now back UFC sensation Ronda Rousey. Now Ronda Rousey dissing wrestling, putting wrestling down after she left in 2019, is now back in professional wrestling because, like Lisa had said, she needs the money. So she returns, she wins the Royal Rumble, and most people think at WrestleMania 38 she will face Becky Lynch for the championship. So there you have it, guys. All the Royal Rumble winners: Hacksaw Jim Duggan, Big John Studd, Hulk Hogan twice, Ric Flair, Yokozuna, Bret Hart and Lex Luger, Shawn Michaels twice, Stone Cold Steve Austin twice, Vince McMahon, The Rock, Stone Cold Steve Austin, Triple H, Brock Lesnar, Chris Benoit, Batista, Rey Mysterio, Undertaker, John Cena, Randy Orton, Edge, Alberto Del Rio, Sheamus, John Cena, Batista, Roman Reigns, Triple H, Randy Orton, Nakamura, Seth Rollins, Drew McIntyre, Edge, and Brock Lesnar. And for the women, Asuka, Becky Lynch, Charlotte Flair, and Ronda Rousey. So that is all the Royal Rumble winners. I said in the title that it would just be the women. Again, Hacksaw Jim Duggan, the first Royal Rumble winner, 1988. Brock Lesnar, your latest Royal Rumble winner. I gave you the best of what I knew, the storylines surrounding them, and how it came about, how the Royal Rumble came about as a promotional tactic against Jim Crockett Promotions, proving that WWE could promote a card on regular cable, just like Jim Crockett Promotions had promoted Clash of Champions. They had the Royal Rumble. Royal Rumble then turned out to be one of the biggest traditions in WWF/WWE history. The biggest, as a matter of fact, because they stopped. They do the war games as far as NXT, but they really don't do the war games in the way that the war games is to be done. So it's Big Hacksaw Jim Duggan, Big John Studd, Hulk Hogan twice, Ric Flair, Yokozuna, Brett and Luger, Shawn Michaels twice, 95 and 96, Stone Cold Steve Austin twice, 97 and 98, Vince McMahon, The Rock, Stone Cold Steve Austin, Triple H, and anyway, you gotta watch the whole video. I'm not going over them again. But Bro- Brock Lesnar, Chris Benoit, again, Chris Benoit, 2004, wiped from the history books. But I feel like 1994, 2004, and 2014 were kind of the same story. Somebody that Vince McMahon wanted. Vince McMahon really wanted Lex Luger because he'd been pushing Lex Luger since Luger got there in '92, you know, and he really wanted Batista in 2014. That's why he made Batista have Batista win the 2014 Royal Rumble. He really wanted, I think, Shawn Michaels in 2004. But people wanted Benoit, people wanted Daniel Bryan, and people wanted Bret Hart. Three technical wrestlers that are very similar. Now, we're not at WrestleMania 40 yet. We got 2 years to go to that. But could it be possible that the person, man or woman, that walks out of WrestleMania 40 as the champion could be a technical wrestler, could be a smaller wrestler, could be the underdog and the dark horse challenger? If history is to be believed, that is going to be true. And it's funny that the whole story of professional wrestling is kind of the underdog. How many times did Hulk Hogan go in a match like he was against Andre the Giant, or he was against um, Earthquake, or he was against Yokozuna, or he was against even the Giants when he first fought the Giant in WCW in 1995? He was the underdog. So people love an underdog story. Even when Donald Trump, even going into politics, was the underdog in 2016, Hillary Clinton was the juggernaut. She was slated both in 2008 and 2016 when she ran, and she ended up not winning either election. So sometimes the one you want is not always the one you get, even in politics and something as orchestrated or as trivial as professional wrestling. Even though I don't feel like wrestling really is trivial, but some people kind of do think it's trivial. But it's kind of parallels with politics, especially when you can't mention the history of WrestleManias without mentioning Donald Trump, and you can't mention the history of American politics without mentioning Donald Trump either. Not to say that I like Trump or I dislike Trump, it just is what it is. As Randy Savage said when he won World War III in 1995, what it is what it is. In that, he won the WCW Championship because the WCW Championship had been held up after the Giants stole the WCW Championship from Hulk Hogan. I don't know why WWE history in retrospect says that he won the WCW Championship. He didn't. He was disqualified after Lex Luger came down and Lex Luger turned heel, joining the Dungeon of Doom. He never won the championship. The championship was vacated and Randy Savage won it. But unfortunately, just like in the WWF, Randy Savage's title runs in WCW were overshadowed by Hulk Hogan. Like, even though Hulk Hogan wasn't the champion, he always He was always in the front, and Randy Savage was always in the back. Not really towards the end of '95. Randy Savage and Ric Flair kind of lit their feud up after WCW had their first triple threat match. ECW had theirs in '95. WCW had theirs in '95. Their first triple threat match was Starrcade 1995 between Lex Luger, Ric Flair, and Sting for the number one contendership against Randy Savage. Ric Flair won it and ended up winning the WCW Championship in 1995 from Randy Savage. Randy Savage and Ric Flair feuded in two promotions. Anyway, that is basically it about the Royal Rumble. We'll see who wins the Royal Rumble 2023. We're nowhere there yet, but we'll see what WrestleMania brings us. Anyway, the list of presidents: Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Quincy Adams, Jackson, Van Buren, Harrison, Tyler, Polk, Taylor, Fillmore, Pierce, Buchanan, Lincoln, Johnson, Grant, Hayes, Garfield, Arthur, Cleveland, Harrison, Cleveland, McKinley, Roosevelt, Taft, Wilson, Harding, Coolidge, Hoover, Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden. Peace. It wasn't Royal Rumble winners, and that came out of nowhere, guys. Sorry for that. Apologize. But I guess, you got to flex where you flex. Sometimes you got to flex like Lex Luger flexed when he debuted at Royal Rumble 1993 when he was the narcissist. Sometimes you get narcissistic. Sometimes you blow the roof off the place like Michael Jackson did that same year, 1993, at the Super Bowl. He was on top of the world, baby. On top of the world. It's cool to be on top of the world and channel Mason Brandy or Brandy and Big Pun. Peace. Love you guys. Ooh, yeah. And it's crazy that it's a shame that Randy Savage never won a Royal Rumble. Or Scott Hall never won a Royal Rumble. But he did win a World War III, though. World War III, 1998, he won. And he went on to face Sting for the championship that year in Uncensored, and he was unsuccessful. It was only two world title matches he ever had in either company. Anyway, guys, it's winter weather. Stay warm, stay safe. Peace.